And if you have struggled in your life because you are the type of person that holds grudges easily, and you are the type of person that holds on to things easily, and you are the type of person that doesn't let go, and I don't want to forgive them, I don't want them to think that I'm weak, I don't want them to trample all over me, and I'm not going to be that person. And let me just confront you with the idea and the notion that perhaps you haven't spent enough time wondering and pondering and thinking and analyzing and understanding and marinating in how much God has forgiven you.
Prepare ye the way of the Lord.
Welcome to the worldwide outreach of Skillman Church of Christ in Dallas, where we invite you to connect, grow, serve, and go. Now with today's message, here's Joel Sanchez.
I've been for a while now wanting to talk about forgiveness. And it's kind of interesting because when I was thinking about becoming a preacher, one of my greatest fears was that I would run out of things to say, right? Really, I looked at these guys and thank you for that. Some of you are like, wow. No, you never have to be afraid of that. Trust us. We know you can never run out of things to say. You know what I'm saying? Wow, thanks. I'm not sure how to feel about that. I'll have to go home and think about it. But no. I really thought, like, okay, when you've been preaching for 2 or 3 years, like, what do you do? Like, okay, now we're gonna preach about this other stuff that I've preached all over again. And one of the big things that you find when you're preaching and when you're in ministry is that you really don't run out of things to say. The breadth and depth and scope of the Bible and the breadth and depth and scope of the human condition is such that there's a lot to be said. And so for a while, I've been wanting to preach on forgiveness and wanting to talk about forgiveness, and I haven't been able to fit it in, and it just kind of happened that it fit in for the next 2 weeks. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And here's why, for me, and here's why I've been wanting to talk about this for a long time. If you've been alive for more than 25 minutes, you'll know that forgiveness is one of those things that you're going to have to practice in your life. You're going to have to practice it because at some point you're going to offend somebody. I know you think you're wonderful and you're amazing, and you are. But at some point you're going to say something and you're going to do something, and maybe you didn't mean it, and maybe it wasn't your intention, but you're going to have to go to somebody and ask for forgiveness. And if you're sitting here and you're saying, I've never had to do that, then boy, is this sermon for you. Right? You're like, no, not me. Never had to go ask anybody for forgiveness. You know me. I'm just kind of one of those people. Never need to do that. Here's also the other reason why this sermon is important. It's because at some point, you're going to have to extend forgiveness to somebody else. At some point, somebody is going to do something to you, whether they meant it or not, whether they know it or not, whether they apologize or not. Somebody is going to do something to you, and you're going to have to make the choice. Are you going to carry the bitterness and the anger and the pain, or are you going to let it go, and are you going to forgive them? And I thought that it was a good topic to discuss right around this time of the year. And here's why I thought that it may be a good topic to discuss right around this time of the year. And that's because in a couple of weeks, Thanksgiving is going to come around. And in a couple of weeks after that, Christmas and New Year's are going to come around. And I don't know, perhaps for you, perhaps for someone else, the time when you get together with family and a time when you get together with friends, and it's fun, and it's people that you haven't seen maybe in a year, maybe in over a year. And maybe you get along with everybody that's going to be sitting around the dinner table, and maybe you get along with everybody that's going to be sitting around the tree, and you get along with everybody that's going to be sitting around the fireplace, but maybe you don't. And maybe there are people that you're going to have to see and talk to and interact with as you go to family gatherings and family events and Christmas parties at work and all that stuff. You're going to have to encounter people and see people that either you know that you offended in one way or another, or people who have offended you. And you're going to have to put on the happy face, right? And you're going to have to find a way to avoid making eye contact with them throughout the time that you're going to be hanging out together. And you're going to have to find a way to be civil and to be nice and to not fight, all that stuff that's kind of frowned upon at all times, especially during the holidays. You're going to have to make this effort to put on this face. And maybe this is the year when you kind of begin to deal with that and you begin to let God work in that area of your life. Forgiveness is a difficult topic because there's times when you've got to forgive somebody because they, said something about you that wasn't true. And there's times when you have to forgive somebody because, they didn't pay you back the $50 that you lent them, that they told you they were totally going to pay you back. And every time you see them, they're buying new stuff and they're doing all this stuff, and you're angry because, he didn't pay me my $50 back. And, I'm not going to bring it up because it doesn't bother me, but it does bother me. I don't care. I don't care. I'm fine. I'm over it. I really, it is not, do I look like I'm upset? Do I sound like I'm not upset? Not upset. I'm fine. Lend you $50 again, tell you that much. I just hope he comes and asks me for another $50 because I know what I'm going to say. I know what I'm going to say when he comes and asks me for $50. So there's that type of offense that you have to forgive. But when you talk about forgiveness, then you got to talk about big forgiveness, and you got to talk about people that have really hurt you. You've got to talk about people that abused you, and you've got to talk about people that left you and never bothered to say why. You've got to talk about family members. You got to talk about moms and dads and kids and cousins and coworkers and bosses and people that got you fired when you did nothing wrong. And you've got to talk about people that said some really bad things to you that you still carry around with you. And you got to talk about people that are not interested in apologizing to you. They don't care. They don't think they did anything wrong. They think you did something wrong, as a matter of fact, and you're the one that needs to apologize to them. That's fun. When you think that somebody needs to apologize to you and you go talk to them and they clarify for you and they say, oh, no. Actually, you're the one that needs to apologize. I'm so glad that you came because you're the one that needs to apologize to me. And how do you deal with forgiving somebody who continues to hurt you? How do you deal with forgiving somebody who's no longer around? You can't talk to them. You can't have a conversation. They're either not capable of having a conversation with you anymore, or they're not on this earth for you to have a conversation. But it still hurts, and you're still holding a grudge, and you still cry about it, and you still get angry like it was yesterday. And yet the command is to forgive. And I don't know about you, but I don't like forgiveness. I will tell you, it is not my strong suit. I know you think that preachers are supposed to be perfect. I'm a big fan of holding on to a grudge for a long time. I am being blatantly, brutally honest with you. I'm a big fan of holding on to a grudge for a long time. I do not let go of things easily. I don't. But yet that's what I'm supposed to do. And that's what the Bible calls me to do. And here's the deal. Forgiveness sounds very weak. And forgiveness sounds like you can do whatever you want to me and I'm going to forgive you and it's just going to be fine. Everything rolls off my back. And I'm not going to be a pushover. I'm not just going to let you do whatever you want with me and then I'm just going to forgive you and then we're all going to move on and hold hands like we're friends. I don't like that. And I don't want you to think that. And a lot of us think that way, I'm a strong person, and I'm going to teach you a lesson. If you mess with me, man, I'm going to put up the walls, and it's just over, because you and everybody else are going to know. And yet the Bible calls you and I to forgive. So here's what I want to do this week. I want to talk about the theological foundation for forgiveness. Next week, I'm going to talk about how you forgive, and how you forgive when somebody doesn't apologize, and whether forgiveness means that you have to reconcile with the person or not, and how do you forgive somebody who's continuing to hurt you. And I'm going to talk about a little bit more of the how and the logistics, or the kind of the basics of forgiveness and what you do and what you don't do. But today, I want to talk about the basis for forgiveness. Because if you don't, like if somebody is not here today and they come next week and I'm talking about forgiveness and they are like me, they struggle with that, next week is not going to be a good sermon for them. It just isn't. I'm just letting you know. Like, if you see somebody next week and they weren't here today, and they ask you what the sermon was about, and you tell them the sermon was about forgiveness, and it's going to be about forgiveness again today, but let me tell you, because you weren't here last week, you're probably not going to like this week. Just tell them, just be honest, because then they're going to think it's me. Grab your Bible, or your phone, or your iPad, or whatever you kids are using these days. Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18. So in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 18, the theme of chapter 18 is relationships among Christians and among believers. And so that's why when you get to verses 1 through 5 in Matthew 18, the disciples come to Jesus and they say, hey, who is the greatest in the kingdom? Because the disciples are trying to figure out the pecking order, and they're trying to figure out, if Jesus is talking about this whole dying thing, they're all trying to figure out basically when he goes, who's going to be in charge. And so that's when Jesus comes in and has the discussion about the little children, and basically laying out for them, this isn't about who's bigger and who's greater and who's not. Everybody's kind of equal in the kingdom. And then there's a discussion about not being a stumbling block. And it follows that, because what Jesus is saying, instead of being concerned about who's bigger and who's greater and who's not, make sure that you're not being a stumbling block to other people as you're walking in your faith. And then there's a discussion about the shepherd and the lost sheep. And again, what Jesus is saying is, instead of being concerned with who's bigger and who's better, you should be concerned with one another, in the very same way that a shepherd, when he has a sheepfold and one of them goes away, he goes out after it. You should be, instead of being a stumbling block to one another, you should be looking out for each other and living a life in such a way that when one of you gets lost, instead of wondering who's bigger and who's better and who's badder, that you're actually able and willing to go out and look for that person. And then they get into this discussion about forgiveness. And the early part, before verse 21, is talking about somebody who sins against you and that person is not repentant. And that's when Jesus says you got to bring them before witnesses, and if they repent, then great. But if they don't repent, then you cast them out and you treat them as you would somebody who is not of the kingdom. And then Peter, because Peter is Peter, and Peter likes to make sure that he understands everything exactly the way that it needs to be, says in verse 21, and Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times? When somebody comes and asks you a question, and within the question, still in the form of a question, they give you an answer? Mom, how much money are you going to give me today? $50? Right? Like there's, how late can I stay out? Till midnight? Right, there's an implication that I'm asking you a question, but in the same question that I'm asking, I'm also giving you the answer that I expect you to give me. How many times shall I forgive my brother who sins against me? 7 sound cool? Now here's the thing, there were some rabbis that taught that 3 times. Somebody sins against you, they commit the same offense 3 times, you should forgive them up to 3 times. After that, you shouldn't. Because remember, the rabbis were supposed to interpret the law. And so they picked arbitrarily the number 3. So some rabbis went around teaching, you should forgive somebody 3 times, after that we're done. So when Peter comes up to Jesus, and Peter says, how many times should I forgive somebody? Maybe 7. Peter thinks he's being really generous, right? Peter thinks, oh, this is pretty good. Let me throw in 7. And Jesus comes back and he says, Jesus answered, I tell you not 7 times, but 77 times. And so, if for the recovering Pharisees among us, that doesn't mean that you now get to pull out your Excel spreadsheet, right, and start keeping track on your forgiveness app, you know, how many times I've forgiven this person. Jesus picks the number 77, not because it's the actual number, but Jesus is just using a play on words. When Peter says, how often should I forgive him? Should I forgive him 7 times? And Jesus said, how about 77 times? Does that sound like a better number to you? Does that sound good? That sound a little bit silly? And then he goes on to tell a story. Therefore, verse 23, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 talents was brought before him. In that time, in some ways like today, rulers of certain regions would set up servants whose responsibility it was to collect taxes on behalf of the ruler for a certain region. And so throughout the year, the servant was supposed to collect taxes, and at the end of the year, he would come and settle accounts with the ruler of that region. Today, we call that April 15th. And so Jesus is telling the story of this ruler who is coming in and settling his accounts with one of his servants. And he finds that the servant owes him 10,000 talents. When all the commentators talk about the amount of money that 10,000 talents is, it's a lot of money. It's, in today's time, let's say $1 billion. Which is ridiculous, right? I mean, it's such a lot. Nobody owes anybody $1 billion. Like, how does somebody owe you $1 billion and you don't know? Like, maybe if they owed him $1,000, but I'll tell you, if you owe me $22, I'll remember, okay? I'm just telling you. So Jesus picks this number that is ludicrous, that is absurd, it's ridiculous. It's impossible for any servant to owe any ruler $1 billion, 10,000 talents. That's unheard of. That is not even a real number, but Jesus is using a ridiculously exaggerated number because he is trying to tell a story. This is not based on real life. This is a story that Jesus has made up in order to illustrate a point. So you have to understand that the sum that is given out is just a ridiculous amount of money. The servant is brought to him, owes him 10,000 talents. 25, since he was not able to pay, no kidding, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. That's also silly. That's also ridiculous because there's no number of people that you can sell to get $1 billion. So the story is told in such a way that this is not even real. The sums of money that are being thrown out and the way that people are saying, you owe me $1 billion, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to sell your wife and your kids and I'm going to put you in prison. And well, if I'm in prison, how am I supposed to pay you back? And if you sell my wife and kids, I mean, they're pretty and all, but they're not $1 billion pretty. Like, you're not going to get that much money for them. You maybe get $10,000, 20 grand, maybe $1 million at most. But I mean, it's ridiculous. 26, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. Also ridiculous. Also, just not going to happen. It's like somebody who owes you $20,000 and you demand that they pay you back, and they say, listen, just be patient with me. I can pay you $4 a month. Really? So it's going to take you 84 years to pay me what you owe me. Like, is that even? So not only is the amount of money that the guy owes ridiculous, and not only is the way that he thinks that he's going to pay him back ridiculous, but even the idea that he can pay him back is silly. You don't have $1 billion. There aren't enough lifetimes for you to pay me back what you owe me. This whole thing, all these numbers are just, we're not even working with real numbers here. The guy falls to the ground. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay everything back. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. That also is just, like, the story is not believable. And Jesus tells the story in such a way that is not, it's outrageous. It doesn't make sense. Owes you $1 billion, you're upset, you're going to put him in jail and sell his kids and his wife. He gets on his knees and he begs you and tells you, I'm going to pay you back, and then you take pity on him and you're like, it's fine, it's cool, no problem. By the way, if you know that person that you can just borrow $1 billion from and they're cool just not letting you pay it back, because I'd like to get a loan from them. 28. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. So here's where the story begins to get real. When the servant goes out, he found one of his, and it's interesting because in the text, it doesn't tell you whether the first servant went out to find the guy who owed him money or if he just found the guy that owed him money. You don't know. But it says that the guy that had been forgiven a whole rack of money goes out and just somehow, whether he looked for him or not, finds a guy that owes him 100 denarii. And if 10,000 talents was about $1 billion, 100 denarii was about 3 months' wages. So in the first story, the amount of money that was owed was inconceivable. And in the second story, the amount of money that is owed is actually reasonable. That's reasonable, that somebody would owe you the equivalent of 3 months' salary. That's reasonable. That you would have lent somebody that amount of money. That's understandable. Verse 29. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me, and I will pay you back. It's funny, the very same words that the second servant uses are the very same words that the first servant used. Be patient with me, and I will pay you back. Verse 30, but he refused Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, mostly because they said, if he did that to him, he's probably coming for me. So they did the right thing. They went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said. "I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" In anger, his master turned him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how, verse 35, my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart. You know, sometimes you read stories in the Bible and like you have to research and read them over again and call somebody and Google and find a commentary to know what the story means. This is not one of those. This is actually pretty simple. And you know how sometimes in the Bible you don't know if the story applies to you, if it applies to other people, if it only applied. This one applies to you. Because Jesus was not talking to the crowd, he was talking to disciples. And the end of the story is very clear. When the master found out what the first servant did, he was angry and he threw him in jail. And he said, "Now you're going to be tortured because you didn't do for him what I did for you." Here's why I wanted to start this discussion on forgiveness with that story. You cannot pretend to have a forgiving heart towards others unless you can fully grasp how much God has forgiven you. One of the things that I've realized in my own life and in my own experience is that my unwillingness to forgive is directly related to my unawareness of how much God has forgiven me. You see, before we can talk about the person that you have to forgive or the person that needs to forgive you, or before we talk about that, you have to have a heart and a posture of forgiveness. And if you have struggled in your life because you are the type of person that holds grudges easily, and you are the type of person that holds on to things easily, and you are the type of person that doesn't let go, and I don't want to forgive them, I don't want them to think that I'm weak, I don't want them to trample all over me, and I'm not going to be that person. And let me just confront you with the idea and the notion that perhaps you haven't spent enough time wondering and pondering and thinking and analyzing and understanding and marinating in how much God has forgiven you. You want to know why the amount that the first guy was forgiven was so outrageous? Because what you and I did to God was equally as outrageous and unforgivable. You sit now. I know you're a good person. I know you haven't killed anybody. I know that. And I know you probably won't. I know. But think about your relationship with God. And I'm not talking about just shame, and I'm talking about the ways that you have failed God. And how he has forgiven you and restored you and lifted you up and encouraged you. The way that God has guided you and prospered you even when you didn't ask for it. The way that God has led you and provided for you even when you weren't praying. The way that God has been faithful to you even when you were not faithful to him. the way that God has promised to love you through everything that you go through, the way that God has promised to give you a home in heaven and a hope for eternity, the way that God, seemingly in an irresponsible way, has overlooked all of your offenses and is always ready and willing to take you back. If you understand how good God has been to you and how much He has overlooked in your life, why aren't you willing to do that for someone else? I'm not saying that you're saying that what they did was okay. I'm not saying that. But perhaps before you even dive into the idea of who is it that I have to forgive, perhaps it starts with, God, would you give me a heart and would you give me a posture of forgiveness? You see, because when I don't want to forgive you for something that you did to me, my attitude is, how dare you do that to me? How dare you treat me that way? How dare you disrespect me that way? How dare you? And then I got to turn around and talk to God and say, God, would you please forgive me for the ways that I have dared to disrespect you and to offend you and to break your law and to break your covenant. And I expect that when I go to Him, that He's going to forgive me. I expect it and I want it. Why can't I extend the same thing to you? And so perhaps before we talk about who and what and when and how you forgive, the idea is, God, would you give me a posture and a heart that is willing to show the same type of grace and the same type of mercy that you have shown me? Even in the little things. Like even when the person at Starbucks gets your order wrong and they don't use soy milk and you're lactose intolerant. Even when the dry cleaner forgets to put the crease on one of your pants. Sharing some personal story. Really? 4 pairs of pants and you just missed a crease on it? Like, how did that happen? Even in the little things that you get upset about. Gosh, I can't believe these people. God, would you give me a heart and a posture of forgiveness? You know, for that coworker that just annoys you and you know, they just, God, would you, it doesn't mean that I'm going to just let everything go, but would you give me a heart and a posture of forgiveness for my mom or my dad? Every time I talk to them, all they do is they just criticize everything. They criticize my kids, they criticize my house, they criticize my car, they criticize my spouse, they criticize my job, they criticize what I'm wearing. Would you give me a heart and a posture of forgiveness? Whenever some random person that I don't know cuts me off in traffic and the only thing I want to do is just run out behind them, and I don't know what, I don't, like when you step on the gas to try to catch up to them, what do you think is going to happen? I'll tell. Okay, and then you catch up to them and they're not looking at you because they know what's going on. And then you feel dumb and you keep on driving and you realize how futile the whole entire episode was. And for the next 3 hours, anybody that deals with you has to deal with the aftermath of some dude that cut you off on 75. God, would you give me a heart and a posture of somebody who has been forgiven a lot, because I have been. You know, and maybe if you don't, maybe this week you do need to go home and you need to spend some time with God. God, would you remind me, not like in a shameful kind of way, but would you remind me of how much you have overlooked in my life. So that when somebody comes across my way today, stranger or loved one, and they offend me, knowing or unknowingly, they do something that makes me angry, knowing or unknowingly, before I launch to defend and offend myself, before that seed of bitterness and anger gets planted, would you, in that moment and in that space and in that time, remind me of how much you have overlooked in my life? And then with that spirit and with that posture of gratitude, may I deal gently with my brother. May I deal gently with my sister. May I deal gently with my kids, with my husband, with my wife, with my coworker, with my boss, with my friend, with my neighbor. May I deal gently with them as somebody who understands that I have been forgiven a lot. I'm going to ask you to stand. And as we do always, our elders come around the room. They're open and ready and willing to pray for you and with you. And so perhaps today, your prayer with them is, I want to be that person. I want to be somebody who is righteous and upright and who stands up for himself, but I want to be known as a person that has a posture and a heart of forgiveness and of grace and of mercy. That's who I want to be. That's how I want to be known. And perhaps if you're here, and this is the first time or the 20th time that you've heard something related to the Bible and to the gospel, there's a God that has forgiven you completely and fully in every single way. He holds nothing against you. And the only thing he wants is a relationship with you. And if you are called by the Spirit to do that, would love to pray with you this morning.